Welcome to the History Nerds United podcast. I'm your head nerd, Brendan. Thank you so much for being here. Today, author Gregory Wallance talking about his book, Into Siberia, about a man who goes into Siberia and comes out and does something amazing. Admits publicly that he was totally wrong about something. Sounds interesting, right? It is. Love talking to Greg, so how about I just shut up and we get on with it? Let's do it. And here we are with author Gregory Wallance, Into Siberia, George Kennan's epic journey through the brutal, frozen heart of Russia. Greg, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, Brendan, thank you for having me.
Listen, I don't know when you sleep. You're a retired lawyer now, but then author, journalist, all of that stuff. Where do you find the time for all of this? And you must just really like reading and writing a lot.
You know, that's really the answer to your question. I like it so much that I find the time, but without sacrificing, I hope, time with my family or sleep time. It's usually early in the morning on weekends, perhaps late at night, early in the morning on weekdays. And it fit very well. It was the writing, particularly when I was a lawyer, a litigator, the writing was a terrific distraction. It was like a mini vacation from the real world.
I want to get into Siberia. Amazing story I've never heard of. And I want to know, where did you first hear about it? When did you decide that this needed to be a book?
Well, I was actually, and you may say at this point, get a life, but I was actually browsing in the National Archives through their digital collections of the papers of Americans, some of whom were well known, some of whom weren't. I was just kind of thinking, what's going to be my next book after the previous one? Yeah, I'd come across this or I'd come across that. It had already been written about, or the story just wouldn't work. And then I came across George Kennan. And in retrospect, I felt like I struck a gold vein or something, because he was unknown, at least today. He was this great explorer, adventurer, a terrific journalist, and he's relevant to today because, and we'll get into how he did it, but he changed the relationship between the United States and Russia in ways that we still feel now.
Now, a quick follow-up, because I know I've talked about this book to a few people and have run into the same problem. When we say the name, George Kennan, there is a little bit of a mix-up. Can you explain that one? Because we've got two of them, and they're actually related, right?
Yep, that's right. There are two George Kennans. There's my George Kennan, whose heyday was the late 19th century, early 20th century. And he was America's great expert on Russia. And then there's a much younger cousin by 50 plus years, also named George Kennan. In fact, he was named after my George Kennan, his older Kennan, because he was so famous and accomplished so much. George Frost Kennan, and that's how I'll distinguish him, George Frost, went on to become America's great 20th century expert on Russia. And even more, he became a diplomat. And at the end, after World War II, he conceived what became the doctrine of containment, which guided 9 American presidents through the Cold War. The premise being that there was a way to contain the Soviet Union and its ambitions, and that eventually it would collapse from its own internal contradictions without a huge world war. And he proved to be absolutely right. One of the reasons that my George Kennan isn't well known is because the younger George Kennan, George Frost, kind of overshadowed him and became the famous Kennan. But there's a hidden story here, which is that my George Kennan became a kind of a role model for the younger George Kennan. And in fact, he said that everything he has tried to do, he thought his older cousin would have wanted a son of his to do had he had a son. And so there's this connection. I call it in my book a changing of the guard. That my George Kennan dealt with Imperial Russia. The younger George Frost, dealt with the Soviet Union.
So before we jump into Kennan's actual story, you know you're an author. You got to catch people. You got to really pull them in right to start. And your prologue got me immediately. Can you tell me a little bit for the listeners about the Bell of Uglich and how it just perfectly encapsulates the whole thing? Can you talk about it for a second?
Well, in 1591, a young boy was found dead in the Volga River town of Uglitch. The reason it was significant, it wasn't just any young boy. He was the heir apparent to the Russian throne. His mother suspected foul play and roused the town people, and they rang the town bell, the 600-pound copper bell, to summon the townspeople to a revolt. When the representative of Ivan the Terrible, the Tsar then, came to try to stop the townspeople, they killed him. Eventually, that revolt was put down, and the forces of Imperial Russia cut off the tongues of 100 people and sent hundreds more into Siberian exile. The bell that had summoned the revolt was taken down from its belfry. And at this point, before I explain what happened, you have to understand that bells have an unusual status in Russia. In fact, they're given names like swan or bear depending on the sound they make. And some, maybe many, think they have a soul and can experience suffering. And the forces of Imperial Russia lashed the bell 12 times, cut off its clapper, the ringer, cut off the ear that it's suspended from, and sentenced it to exile in Siberia. For the next year, Uglitch townspeople, under an armed guard, dragged that bell thousands of miles across rivers, through forests, over the Ural Mountains, till finally they reached the town of Tomsk. And there, the bell was recorded as the first inanimate exile. And Imperial Russian forces told the townspeople never to ring that bell again. But they actually secretly fitted it with a clapper, and then when there was no one around, they rang it. After that, perhaps millions, certainly a million or more Russian subjects followed that bell into Siberian exile.
Now, one of the things, and it's the basic thesis here is Kennan starts out telling people that the exile system, sending prisoners into Siberia, isn't that bad, which seems ridiculous to us, but back then it was kind of an open question. Now, before anybody thinks like, oh, he was probably just, talking and not really thinking and not understanding, Kennan actually had, before he thought this way, he actually had a little, we'll call it a sojourn into Siberia before this. Before he takes his big trip that this book is about. Can you tell me just a little bit about that? How does he end up in Siberia, and why does he think it's not necessarily that bad?
Well, he had always wanted to go on adventures, and an opportunity came up while he was working. This is during the Civil War. He was working in a telegraph office, and nearly because of the wartime stress and the pressure of getting out and receiving and transcribing telegrams, he was close to losing his health and collapsing. And then an opportunity came up for him to join an expedition that was mapping a telegraph line route in Siberia. Just briefly, let me explain. This is one of the most harebrained commercial enterprises anyone ever heard of. The context is this. Various telegraph companies had tried 5 times before and after the Civil War to lay a telegraph cable across the Atlantic Ocean that would connect Europe and the United States. And each time, the cable had snapped and sunk. Western Union, betting that that cable would never be laid, decided to connect Europe and the United States the long way around. And so what they planned to do was first finish laying 2,000 miles of cable, telegraph cable, from San Francisco to British Columbia. Then 2,000 miles across Alaska, then an underwater cable under the Bering Strait, then 2,000 miles of cable across Siberia. In the meanwhile, Russia was going to complete a 7,000-mile cable from St. Petersburg to Siberia and join up what would become a 12,000-mile long way around telegraph cable. Kennan managed to get into the expedition in the Siberian cable, even though his only outdoor experience had been boyhood camping trips just a mile or 2 from his home. And he spent 3 years sleeping in indigenous tribes' yurts next to piles of drying fish and carcasses of reindeer, camping out at night in 50-degree weather. It was so cold that even though he was sitting next to a 10-foot fire, the soup in his cup froze and his eyelids partly froze together. on dog sleds, searching for the route that would allow them to set up this cable. And he loved every minute of it. That whole experience sealed a bond with Russia, which gets us back to your question about his defense of the Siberian exile system.
Which, just a quick aside about his nature, I couldn't help but think of Teddy Roosevelt when I'm reading about Kennan, because it seems like if he's at rest, he's going to get sick. He's just not going to feel well, where if you put him in these impossible scenarios, these adventurous journeys, he seemed to almost get stronger when things were rougher, kind of like Teddy.
He was unquestionably at his most durable when he was on an adventure. And he suffered all through his life from various ailments. None of them were, I think, life-threatening. But just working in that telegraph office, his father looked at him and thought, my son has become a bag of bones. And the doctor, when the family was alarmed at the idea of this young man, 20 years old, with no outdoor experience, going to Siberia, he insisted on having the family doctor examine him. The doctor said, well, Mr. Kennan, to my Kennan's father, look, if you send him, at that point it was Alaska, and then he went to Siberia. If you send him to Alaska, he might live. But I'm telling you, he's going to die if you keep him in that telegraph office. And in fact, as soon as he set sail, he put on weight, the color returned to his cheeks, and he was in his element.
I mean, listen, I love the cold, but he was a bit crazy about it. We're going to leave that alone. He's a hero. It's great. He's saying the exile system isn't that bad. And I know I've read a lot about Russia, and it's crazy now to think that anyone think that this is humane. But can you talk a little bit about the exile system? Because for people who don't understand, exile wasn't like, oh, hey, you're in New York, you're getting exiled to Oklahoma, we're throwing you in a bus and we're driving you out there. The time period that we're talking about, exile, you're going and you're walking, right?
For a lot of them, yes. The exile system, Kennan went into Russia to investigate the exile system in 1885. And he went on the basis of a profoundly mistaken understanding of what it was. He thought it was a penal system. And you had referred to it earlier, Brendan. He had defended that penal system as being at least as humane as perhaps European penal systems. And one of his core arguments was that unlike a European or an American penal system, exile didn't break up the family because wives and children were allowed to accompany their convict father or husband. What he discovered, and he was the first to admit it, was that this was not a penal system. It was a cruel, ruthless instrument of Imperial Russia's exploitation of Siberia's vast natural resources and a tool for punishing and stifling dissent. And in fact, in order to populate Siberia with what was essentially a slave labor force, Imperial Russia used the penal code as a tool for exiling Russian citizens who would otherwise never have wanted to go to Siberia. Capital punishment was abolished in the 18th century, but in its place, murderers were sentenced to life at hard labor in Siberia. Then pretty quickly, the mines, the factories, the farms ran out of murderers to work them. So they started expanding the population that would be subject to exile to just common thieves, people who had cut down trees in the wrong place, Jews who hadn't paid taxes, people who had just been obnoxious to someone who had the power to send them into exile. And the convicts, people who were convicted of a crime, were sent into Siberia in shackles, chains around their wrists, around their feet, and they had to march in parties of 300 under Cossack guard in dust storms in the summer, in deep snow in the winter. So many died on the way that the local towns complained to the regime in Moscow, in St. Petersburg, that they didn't have the resource to bury the dead. And Kennan later remarked that what was surprising, though, was not that so many died, but that so many managed to get through alive and justify, or at least provide that labor force that Imperial Russia needed to generate income from these factories, mines, and farms.
And I want to clarify one thing, too, because as much as I've read about it, there's still some things you get in your head and it blows your mind. The thing that blew my mind from your book is the reminder that Siberia, we think of just it's cold and it's ice the whole time, but it's so huge. There's a bunch of different climates, right? Like it's not always just cold and ice.
In fact, that was part of Kennan's defense of the exile system before he actually saw it. And he argued that the common perception of Siberia is just what you said. It's cold, it's miserable, it's vast wastelands of snow-covered tundra. And as he correctly pointed out, southern Siberia actually has a more moderate climate, and certainly at a more southerly latitude, than St. Petersburg or Moscow. It's where the farms were, it's where the factories were, it's where these mines were. So his argument was that you're not sending them into some cold wasteland, they're going to a place that is survivable. In fact, it was still pretty harsh, but he was correct in describing what was the climate nature of southern Siberia.
And now when Kennan goes out there, this is with the Russian regime's approval, right? But how much latitude did they give him, even though they thought he was on their side?
They gave him actually a remarkable amount of latitude. And as I discovered in a human rights mission I made to the Soviet Union and later to post-Soviet Russia, it seems so monolithic, but there are cracks. And there's a kind of a Russian character that sometimes is open to strangers who seem interested in what's going on. And he took advantage of both the official Russian support he had for his investigation because he was such a friend of Russia. They were aware of his defense of the exile system. He didn't disabuse them that he was a friend of Russia, but Kennan very much intended to conduct a rigorous, thorough, objective investigation. And he did. And the other part of it was that he would present himself. He would just sort of knock on the door in a lot of places, including prisons, and present himself. And he had official letters from the Foreign Ministry and from the Interior Ministry, which helped. And they would give him pretty much free run. Sometimes they'd accompany him, but they allowed him to go into these prisons, inspect the cells, speak to the exiles in these exile marching parties. He followed one exile party for 2 days and ask a lot of questions. And he was genuinely grateful for that, but it made possible what became this thorough 1,000-page book, account, 2 volumes, that had this detailed description of his trip, the exile system, and of Russian life.
What I found very funny is there were still those vestiges of what we would think of as communist Russia, right? There were still kind of spies out there. He had to be careful who he was talking about. What I just found so funny is that he would still run into people who were in charge who'd be like, oh yeah, this is a hellhole. I told him it's a hellhole, but it's a hellhole and it's going to stay a hellhole. You can go see it if you want. That's
what I mean by that sort of, there's this Russian genuineness that you find not necessarily at the official levels, but you'll find out in the country a kind of hey, I'm going to be upfront with you. You're about to inspect the worst prison that you've ever seen, which is what they said to him. What was a little more dicey for him was talking to the political exiles, because they were, in fact, the Russian authorities in St. Petersburg, before he left on his trip, had told him he shouldn't talk to these exiles. And he had a perception, these political exiles, as being wild-eyed nihilists, perhaps educated young men and women, but some violent, totally impractical plans for Russia. And one of the things that started to have an impact was his first encounter with these exiles, because they were like him. They were well-educated, very articulate. Some of them spoke very good English, very clear ideas about what they wanted to achieve, which was most often some kind of constitutional reform, great admirers of the United States and its system of government. And that was probably where he was starting to draw the most attention. But no one really tried to interfere with him from talking to these people and so on. But he became most concerned that sooner or later, if he kept talking to the exiles, he would be arrested, kicked out of Russia. But it never happened.
Now, just a hypothetical for you. How much would I have to pay you for you to take Kennan's trip? You'd have to use the same lodgings. It would be the same quality as he had to stay. How much would I have to pay you to do it?
You mean, how much would I want to spend 8 months traveling in the worst kind of conditions in horse-drawn carriages that had no springs or seats, of which Kennan said after one particularly long journey that he felt as though he had been beaten head to foot with a club and then left for dead, to go into prisons where you contract disease, and above all, to be debilitated by exposure to the sheer human suffering of the exile system, which Kennan found harder to bear than the physical beating he took.
Don't forget the lice and all the other bugs. Don't forget
and
the bugs.
Lice come down with lice that he found, he contracted it from prisons, and the thought that he was infected with lice head to foot, and in his clothing and luggage from the criminals in those prisons was almost a moral burden he couldn't bear. But he managed to get through it. He was remarkable. I think I might have been crushed by it. He had such a zest, and that's what impressed me so much. He had such a zest for adventure that even at the worst points, I don't think he would have wanted to be anywhere else but where he was at that moment.
Which, that journey is amazing in and of itself. I totally agree with you. Although I would say what really impressed me more than anything is, and we mentioned it, he was wrong and he admitted it. I mean, this is especially back in the day. Nowadays, people won't even admit they're wrong unless they absolutely have to. He went out there and he was willing to come back and say, "Whew, I messed this one up big time."
He was willing to say that right in the middle of his investigation. And there was a point where he realized how wrong he was when he investigated a forwarding prison and asked to see the barrack cells, huge barracks, where the women and children were kept. And they were in horrible, overcrowded conditions where the odor of feces and urine rose from the floor. But what struck him was the number of young women nursing babies who came up to the warden who was with him, pleading to be allowed to go with their babies into the bathhouse because they couldn't keep the babies warm at night. This barracks only had cloth sheets for walls. And the warden kept saying, "I can't do that. It's better for you here." And Kennan asked the warden, "Why won't you let them sleep in the bathhouse? This is too cold. The cold air comes through those cloth sheets." And the warden said, "I tried that." And the babies died in the bathhouse from the overheated conditions, the lack of air in the bathhouses. It's just better to have a better chance of survival here. And that night, Ken couldn't sleep because he kept thinking of these babies dying in this prison, and because how had he defended the exile system as keeping families together? And what he saw was that, as he put it, these women and children were being horribly punished, going through this horrible suffering for no reason. They hadn't committed a crime, for no reason other than the love of the husband or father that had compelled them to accompany that husband or father on this journey. And he then, while he was still in that town, there was good ability to write letters to the United States from at least the larger towns in Siberia. He wrote a letter to his publisher at the Century Illustrated monthly magazine. And he said, "I have been wrong. I did not understand the exile system. I wrote and lectured on something I was uninformed about. But it's better for me to admit it than to pretend that it is what I thought it was when it wasn't."
It's also hard to understand and see. You just mentioned that warden, where I think that dichotomy between good and evil, that these poor people are being exiled, and then there are these wardens out there, and they're probably all evil and terrible people. There was a lot of people in here who were trying to not make this terrible. Was that surprising for you that there were so many people who were like, "I'm stuck here just like they are. I'm doing my best." And they had these good hearts, but they were just stuck. There was nothing they could do.
In a way, it was a relief to find that there were humane people, even though they were very limited in what they could do. And Kennan realized that the story of the young women with their babies, he realized that the warden was really sympathetic to their plight, but they were beyond the help of a humane warden. And there were also some extremely cruel ones, which Kennan also encountered. But there were enough humane ones that I think it made his story his journey even more interesting to write about them and their reaction to the suffering. Some openly admitted it. Some tried to just pretend it didn't exist without making it worse. And others tried to do what they could to help the warden and ended up losing their careers, to help the exiles, losing their careers.
Now, he comes back, writes an account, he mea culpa, I was wrong. What happens then? Right? You talked about at the very beginning, how much does this actually have an effect? Because up until this point, right, the US and Russia had pretty good relations. How much damage does his account do?
Well, Kennan was recovering from his trip in London with his wife, and she barely recognized him when he finally emerged from Siberia. He wrote a friend that he was going to do something about the exile system, and indeed, perhaps about the lack of freedom in Russia. And he wrote to his friend that if by the time I have finished writing my book and giving my lectures, I have not touched the hearts of the American people, then I will think that the American people have no hearts to be touched or sympathies to be roused. What he did was he wrote 29 articles for the Century magazine, a 2-volume, 1,000-page book based on those articles. And then he went on a lecture tour that lasted 9 years, speaking to as many as 1 million people at 800 separate appearances. He was an absolutely spellbinding speaker, as attested to by his own agent, who also represented Mark Twain and Walt Whitman. And when he spoke, reporters covered his speaking engagements, and I was able to reconstruct what happened. One reporter wrote that you could almost smell the air in these horrible prison cells, which someone compared to the air of a disinterred grave. People sobbed. 2,000 people in the audience were sobbing during his speeches, during his lectures. And at one point, he stopped speaking, and there was silence in the audience for a full minute. Not a sound could be heard. And then thunderous applause broke out. And by the time he finished his lecture tour, Americans were so appalled and angry at Russia's mistreatment of its own citizens that the relationship was never the same. Kennan wasn't the only cause, but Kennan was probably the principal reason why an era of friendship between the United States and Russia ended and was replaced by the era that we know now of suspicion and apprehension. And partly because it was at a point in American history when public opinion had begun to affect diplomacy, where it could not be ignored by diplomats. And the Russian government realized that this was happening. They regarded Kennan as doing incalculable damage to Imperial Russia. They used agents to try to discredit him. This was before the era where Stalin and Putin used poison or radioactive isotopes of some kind to kill their opponents in other countries. They tried to discredit him, but they failed. And he did succeed in transforming the American-Russian relationship.
Now, Greg, I can't imagine that anybody could listen, because we just did setup here, right? We didn't get into the details. There was so much more in this book. But there are misguided people out there who think history is terrible. It's a class they took in high school. They don't want to take it anymore. Siberia is depressing. If I sat one of those people in front of you and they're like, I don't like history, but why are you going to tell me to read Into Siberia? What would you say?
Because this is not a book with dates and names. This is a book about adventure. And it tells history, but it tells it through the eyes of an extraordinary person who just hungered to explore, to find new vistas, to see countries and see them as close as he could. And I guarantee you, you will not find that boring.
I totally agree, Greg. Thank you so much for coming on. The book is fantastic. I really appreciate your time.
Brendan, thank you. I really enjoyed this.
And that's it for this episode. Greg, thank you so much for coming on. Into Siberia, perfect Christmas read. It's cold. Siberia is cold. It all matches up. And for our listeners in the Southern Hemisphere, it's a perfect book to remind you what cold feels like. It'll be back soon, I promise. That is it for Season 2. We will be back for Season 3 in January. Although, keep your ears open around Christmas time. We might have a few presents for you. Make sure you're subscribed. You'll see them. In the meantime, before we see you next season, hit us up, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. Book reviews will still be going up all the way through until Season 3 starts again, so hope to see you out there. Happy holidays to everybody, whatever you're celebrating. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next year.
History.